Okay, welcome to the deep dive. We're taking a close look today at a piece of philosophy that feels, well, almost spookily relevant, even though it's nearly 2,000 years old.
Yeah, we're diving into Seneca the Younger's classic essay on the shortness of life.
And this isn't just some dusty old text, is it?
Not at all. It feels like a direct challenge, really, to how most of us live right now. Seneca, he was a Roman Stoic philosopher,
Right.
wrote this around 49 AD, give or take, and he addressed it to his father-in-law, Paulinus.
Paulinus, wasn't he some kind of big shot in Rome?
Oh, yeah. Seriously demanding job. He was the prefectus annano, basically, the superintendent of Rome's grain supply. Hugely important, hugely stressful.
Okay, so you can imagine Paulinus feeling overwhelmed, maybe complaining life's too short. Sounds familiar.
Totally familiar. We're all there, aren't we?
Yeah.
Packed schedules, feeling constantly busy, always wishing for just a bit more time.
Exactly. So Seneca hears this common complaint, and he kind of nods along, says, yeah, life seems short, but then, bam, he drops this bombshell.
He really does. He says the problem isn't the amount of time nature gives us.
Mm-hmm.
The real issue, he argues, is how we waste the time we actually have. We fritter it away on things that, well, just don't matter in the long run.
That's his radical starting point, isn't it? He pushes back hard against that usual complaint.
He does. He argues life is ample and long enough if it were well expended. I think the direct quote is something like, "We do not receive a short life, but have made it so."
We make it short. Wow,
Yeah.
that's the core idea. And he draws this line in the sand, this distinction between the busy, the occupati, he calls them,
Right, the occupati.
and the few people who genuinely live because they use their time wisely. It's a really stark contrast.
He's got this great analogy, too. Think about managing money, right?
Okay.
You could have a huge fortune, but if you got a reckless guardian, poof, it's gone in no time.
Right, squandered.
But even a modest sum, like a small amount, can grow and grow if it's managed carefully by a good keeper.
Ah, I see. So our life, our time is like that fortune.
Exactly. It shrinks down to almost nothing if we waste it. But if we manage it with intention, it expands. It feels longer, more substantial.
And Seneca, he doesn't just leave it there. He has a list, right?
Right.
A very, very long and pointed list of exactly how these occupations waste their time.
Oh, yeah, it's quite the catalog. He goes through all the ways people just throw away their most precious resource.
Mm-hmm.
Some are kind of obvious vices,
Like what?
like relentless greed, always
Yeah.
needing more, or getting lost in, say, excessive drinking or just chasing physical pleasure. Ambition, too, but the kind that's purely driven by what other people think,
Keeping up with the Joneses, Roman style.
basically.
Mm-hmm.
Or the mad dash for trade and profit, getting consumed by social climbing, flattery. And he really notes how many people spend all their time dealing with the demands of others. Clients, lawyers, politicians needing favors, creditors chasing them down.
So you're constantly being pulled in a million directions by things outside yourself.
Exactly. You spend all this time for everyone else, but there's none left for yourself. You're so
None.
busy tending to other people's stuff, you didn't even have a moment to check in with your own life.
That hits home.
Yeah.
But it's not just the obviously stressed out people, is it? He talks about something else. Busy idleness.
Yes, busy idleness. I love that phrase. This is where even things that look like leisure, or maybe even seem intellectually demanding, are actually completely pointless
How so?
because they don't contribute to living a good life, a truly examined life.
Okay, give me some examples. I remember reading, they really paint a picture, but you can see the modern versions too.
Oh, absolutely. He talks about people like anxiously collecting valuable objects, maybe specific old Corinthian bronzes or rare dinner plates,
Mm-hmm.
spending huge amounts of time, energy, worry on acquiring and maintaining these things that only a tiny handful of other enthusiasts even care about.
Right, like the ancient equivalent of spending a fortune on, I don't know, limited edition sneakers or something, and then stressing about every little scuff mark. Yeah.
Exactly that kind of thing. Focusing intense energy on stuff with no real intrinsic value to your life. Or he talks about people watching wrestling matches or obsessing over athletes,
Okay.
dedicating hours and hours to sports, not for like personal health or connection, but just as this passive, time-sucking spectacle.
That feels pretty familiar today.
And he gets even more specific. Sometimes it's almost funny, but pointed. Like people spending ages focused only on their appearance,
Oh.
getting furious at a barber for cutting one hair wrong.
Yeah.
caring more about their reflection than anything actually important.
Wow.
Or these elaborate banquets that become these stressful social obligations, agonizing over how the silver is laid out or exactly how the meat should be carved.
The pressure to perform, even at dinner.
Totally. He even mentions people who are so dependent they need servants to tell them when it's time to eat or bathe. Being carried around in chairs, totally disconnected from their own bodies, their own time.
So it's not just wasting time on, obviously, bad things, like vices. It's wasting time on anything that isn't actively building your life or your wisdom.
Pretty much, even things that seem harmless or even respectable.
Does that include intellectual stuff too, like studying?
Surprisingly, yes. This is where it gets really interesting. Seneca warns against what he calls pointless scholarship.
Pointless scholarship. What does that mean?
Well, he gives examples of scholars who waste their entire lives debating completely obscure trivia.
Like,
What was the exact number of oarsmen Ulysses had? Or what's the precise chronological order of Homer's works? Or who was the very first Roman general to win a naval battle or use elephants in a parade?
wait, hang on. So even knowing historical facts, that can be a waste of time, according to Seneca.
If that knowledge doesn't actually help you understand how to live a good life, Seneca seems to say, yeah, it can be. It's not about the facts themselves, but the purpose behind seeking them.
Ah.
He lists debates about, weird historical details, gladiatorial games with exotic animals, things like that. He disapproves, seeing it as curiosity wasted on cruelty or just novelty. He mentions discussions about minor historical figures or why certain city boundaries were drawn just so.
So the point isn't that history or knowledge is bad.
Not at all.
It's about why you're pursuing it. If it's just collecting trivia, disconnected facts.
Then it's just busy idleness wearing an academic gown. That's how he sees it.
Okay. So whether it's chasing money, status, quick pleasures, or even just pointless facts, the common thread is these things make you feel frantic, they take up all your time, but they give you nothing really lasting back.
Exactly. They leave absolutely no room for truly living.
And this constant wasting of time, it shapes how the busy person actually experiences their own life, doesn't it?
Fundamentally, yeah. The present moment. It's just fleeting. It's just a way to get to the next thing, the next obligation.
So it feels unsatisfying because you're never really in it.
Never fully present. Always rushing. And the past, Seneca puts it really powerfully. He says the busy cars excluded from this zone of the past.
Excluded. Why?
Because looking back is just too painful. All those past actions, maybe things you regret, vices you've ignored because you were too busy, they become clear when you actually stop and reflect.
So memory becomes something to avoid, something to fear.
Precisely. There's no comfort, no wisdom you can draw from your past. Because it wasn't built intentionally. It's just a blur of activity.
That future, then?
Uncertain. Often feared. They're constantly postponing living, always saying, oh, I'll travel when, or I'll finally relax when I retired 50 or 60.
Right.
Seneca puts it brilliantly. Waiting for the morrow loses today. Dum differiter, vita transcurrit, while it is postponed, life speeds by.
They live as if they're immortal, right? Always putting off the important stuff, the inner work, the meaningful actions until some vague later that might never come.
And the real tragedy, the irony, is when sickness or old age finally hits and death suddenly feels real.
Then they panic.
They panic. They beg for just a few more years, maybe deluding themselves they're younger than they are, but then they die, terrified, filled with regret, realizing they never actually lived when they had the chance.
That's bleak, but it leads straight into Seneca's alternative, doesn't it? The wise life.
Exactly. The counterproposal. This is often linked to philosophy or what he calls otium.
Otium. That's not just kicking back and doing nothing, is it?
No. It's often translated as leisure, but it's more like virtuous repose or meaningful contemplation. Time dedicated to higher pursuits, to self-cultivation.
Okay.
And Seneca argues that the people who pursue this, they are the only ones who truly live. Why? Because they dedicate their time properly.
And the key difference is how they relate to time itself. The wise person, they own their time.
Yes, they control it. They see time for what it is, the single most valuable, non-renewable resource they possess. And because they live intentionally, with purpose, their present moments are fully inhabited. They're actually there.
And the past isn't something to fear for them.
Not at all. Because their actions generally align with wisdom and virtue, they can look back without crippling regret or fear. Seneca says their past is sacred and dedicated, something solid that's beyond the reach of bad luck or future judgment.
Like a foundation they've built.
A solid foundation. And because they've lived fully in the present, and their past holds up to scrutiny, they can anticipate the future without fear. There aren't huge, gaping regrets looming over them. They've done the work.
So a big part of this wise life, for Seneca, involves philosophical study.
Absolutely. He argues that by reading, by contemplating the works of the great thinkers, he mentioned Socrates, Epicurus, his fellow Stoics, you essentially get to associate with them
Across time.
across time. You learn from them, you debate their ideas in your head, you basically live alongside these great minds. He sees this as lifting you up, raising you to that very zone from which nobody can be thrown off.
Wow, that's a powerful image. Like, connecting with this enduring stream of wisdom gives you a kind of timeless perspective.
Exactly. And Seneca suggests this is the only real way a mortal can achieve a kind of immortality. Not through fame or statues or monuments that crumble,
Right.
but by tapping into and maybe even contributing to that timeless realm of wisdom.
And Seneca doesn't just aim this advice at, ordinary folks struggling with busy lives. He uses examples of the most powerful Romans, right, to show this trap affects everyone.
He absolutely does. It's not just about the average Joe. He talks about Emperor Augustus.
The first Roman emperor, the guy who supposedly found Rome brick and left it marble.
That's the one. Even the divine Augustus, the source says, was constantly praying for rest, longing for a vacation from the state.
Really?
Yeah, wishing he could finally step back and just live for himself. Seneca points out that Augustus knew firsthand the intense sweat and the hidden secrets and hardships that came with that immense power. He'd lived through civil wars, conspiracies.
So even the guy at the absolute pinnacle of power felt like his life wasn't really his own.
That's the point Seneca's making. And then there's Cicero.
And famous orator, yeah.
His life was just constant political turmoil, right? Tossed between Catiline, Clodius, Pompey, Crassus, these huge, dangerous conflicts.
Trying to save the Republic.
Exactly. But even Cicero, in the midst of all that, apparently sometimes despised his own famous consulship. And in a letter Seneca quotes, written when Cicero was trying to get away to his farm, he calls himself half-free.
How free. That's striking.
It really is. And Seneca contrasts that immediately with the truly wise person. The wise man, he says, is never half-free.
Why not?
Because true freedom isn't just about external circumstances, it's internal. The wise person is always free from fetters, and of himself more master than the others. They have inner freedom, self-mastery.
Regardless of their job or situation.
Right. The source also mentions another figure, Livius Drusus,
Who was he?
a politician, described as hot, vehement, very ambitious. His laws caused a lot of trouble, apparently. And he reportedly cursed his own restless life. Lamented that he'd never had a proper holiday, not even as a lad, just consumed by ambition from day one, which led to tragedy for him and for Rome. Even late in life, still complaining he had no rest.
So these examples, an emperor, a legendary orator, a fiery politician, they really hammer home Seneca's point, don't they?
Absolutely. Power, fame, critical public duties.
Yeah.
If they consume you entirely, if you let them define you.
They can feel like a prison.
Yeah, leaving you with this profound lack of inner freedom, no real ownership of your own time, your own life.
Which brings Seneca right back to Paulinus, his father-in-law.
Exactly. This isn't just abstract philosophy. He's looking Paulinus right in the eye, metaphorically speaking, and saying, look, you need to change your life.
He tells him to get away from it all.
Pretty much. Get away from the crowd, he urges, and retire at last to a more tranquil harbor.
But it's not just about quitting his job and lounging around, is it?
No, definitely not. Seneca clarifies this isn't a call for, like, dull, helpless rest or just chasing sensory pleasures. It's a call to find new occupations that are nobler.
Nobler pursuits, done in quiet, dedicated time.
Right. And he acknowledges Paulinus' job is important. Managing the grain supply. Crucial, vital work for Rome. And he praises Paulinus' diligence and honesty.
But
then comes that killer line. It's better to begin to draw up the balance of one's life than the appraisal of the public wheat.
Ooh, powerful comparison. Your life's ledger versus the public green stores.
Isn't it? He even hints at the sheer stress and danger involved. He mentions a time under Emperor Caligula when Rome's grain reserves were apparently down to like a week's supply.
Seriously?
Yeah, well, Caligula was busy building pontoon bridges for fun or something. So Seneca's subtly reminding Paulinus of the immense pressure, the potential catastrophe hanging over his head.
Constant anxiety.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He implies it's almost unbearable to know the danger you're in. He's basically saying get out of this high-stress, time-devouring, potentially dangerous job and focus on what actually truly matters in the grand scheme of things.
And what truly matters according to Seneca.
Dedicating yourself to tranquiler, safer, greater things. Contemplating the big questions.
Like the nature of existence?
Yeah, the nature of God, the destiny of the soul, how the universe works, those deep, fundamental inquiries.
These, for Seneca, are the real liberal arts.
The ones that truly liberate you. He says they offer love itself and the practice of virtue, the oblivion of passions, how to live and die, and the great quiet.
Wow. That's where real peace and lasting fulfillment are found, he argues.
That's the promise.
So, okay, let's try and wrap this up. Seneca's core message in On the Shortness of Life, it really boils down to this pretty stark distinction, doesn't it?
It does. Life isn't inherently too short. That's the headline.
We make it short.
We make it short by letting ourselves get consumed by, well, stuff. Things that take all our time, but don't actually give us a meaningful life in return.
Being constantly busy, chasing external validation maybe, following societal pressures, getting lost in pointless distractions.
All of that. Instead of focusing inward on wisdom, on introspection, on living with real intention.
And the tragic result is a life that, no matter how successful or packed it looks from the outside,
Feels empty, rushed, ultimately unlived when you get to the end of it.
that image near the end of the essay is just brutal. The funerals of the busy, he says, should be held by candlelight.
As if they almost hadn't lived at all.
Because they just weren't present for their own lives, they were elsewhere.
Yeah. It really forces you, the listener, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To pause and ask yourself some hard questions.
Like, what does it actually mean for you to truly live?
And how can you tell the difference in your own life between Seneca's busy idleness and activities that are genuinely valuable, genuinely building that good life?
In your own packed schedule right now.
Yeah. And maybe the biggest question, how can you start reclaiming that most precious, utterly irreplaceable resource, your time? Not someday, not when you retire,
But starting today?
right now. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're getting into a bunch of sources you sent over today.
That's right.
And we're looking at a topic that honestly might sound like something from, centuries ago.
Oh, right. Piracy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it turns out it's still very much happening, a live, evolving issue.
Yeah, our mission here is really to unpack the source material,
Mm-hmm.
figure out where modern piracy happens, how, and crucially, why it's not just history.
It's a significant problem today, and these sources, well, they paint a picture that's maybe more complex than you'd first think.
Definitely more complex. It's not just guys with eye patches and parrots anymore.
Okay, so let's dive in. One of the first things that struck me from the material is this link they draw between the return of piracy in the Caribbean, say, in the 2010s, and the Somali piracy we heard so much about.
Ah, yes, the underlying roots.
Exactly. It's suggesting similar origins, often tied to, like, economic and social problems.
It's quite stark when you look at it. The sources really highlight this connection between, large-scale economic pressures and just individual desperation.
How so?
Well, think about it. Big commercial fishing fleets, maybe foreign ones, come into the waters of a low-income country.
Right.
They deplete the fish stocks. Suddenly, local fishermen, people who've done that for generations, their whole livelihood just vanishes.
And that's your only option.
Well, the sources show how some people then feel pushed towards, illegal activities out on the water.
Like the example from Venezuela the sources give during their big economic crisis.
Precisely. Fishermen lose their income, and some turn to piracy. It's a pretty clear illustration of one major driver.
Take away the legit options, and crime becomes, well, an alternative.
A really twisted alternative, yeah. It gives you some insight into the why behind it all.
Okay, so keeping that why in mind, where is this actually happening now? The sources lay out several key areas, right? And they seem quite different.
Absolutely. Different hot spots, different styles of piracy almost. We mentioned the Caribbean linked to that Venezuela crisis.
Yeah, the sources said attacks really spiked in the 2010s.
They did. Starting with daily incidents in places like Sucre State, sometimes pretty violent stuff.
And there was concern about it spreading.
Yeah, the material mentions worries that these Venezuelan pirates might start operating more widely across the Caribbean.
Okay, but then the sources mention a place that just seems totally different. Falcon Lake.
Ah, Falcon Lake. Yeah, that one's interesting because it really challenges the typical image, doesn't it?
It's a lake, a reservoir on the U.S.-Mexico border.
Exactly. And it's known mainly as a drug smuggling route.
Yeah.
So the piracy the sources talk about there is actually more like a violent turf war.
Between cartels, like Los Zetas,
That's what the sources say. Around March 2010, they started fighting it out on the water.
using little boat fleets.
Yeah, fleets is the word used, targeting fishermen, other smugglers, basically anyone on the lake. Armed robberies, shootings, apparently sometimes visible from the Texas side.
Wow. But the material makes a legal point here, doesn't it?
Yes, and it's a really important distinction. Under international law, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea,
Okay.
piracy technically has to happen on the high seas, open ocean.
But Falcon Lake is territorial waters,
Yeah,
U.S. and Mexico.
exactly. So while it's definitely violent maritime crime, it doesn't fit that specific international definition of piracy.
So the term gets used a bit more loosely sometimes.
Very much so. The sources highlight that. Any kind of armed robbery on the water often gets called piracy, even if it's not technically correct by the UN definition.
That's a good nuance.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So moving from a lake to a massive shipping area,
Mm-hmm.
the Gulf of Guinea, West Africa.
Right. Now, this sounds more like what people might imagine, but with a very modern organized crime kind of twist.
How so?
Well, by 2011, this region was a huge global concern. It affected multiple West African countries. And these aren't just, random attacks.
Yeah.
The sources describe them as heavily armed, organized criminal groups, their main goal, stealing valuable oil cargo. And they are extremely violent.
The numbers in the sources look pretty bad for this region.
They were. Really stark. In 2012 alone, the Gulf of Guinea had the most vessel attacks anywhere in the world. Affected nearly 1,000 seafarers, 966, the material says.
And it changed over time.
Yeah, it evolved quickly. At first, maybe they targeted smaller ships, support vessels for oil companies, but they got more aggressive, better armed, bolder. By 2014, a lot of the attacks were happening inside territorial waters.
Which makes it harder for international navies to just sail in and stop them.
Yeah, exactly. Complicates the response significantly.
It definitely organized operations, not just opportunistic crime.
Oh, absolutely. The sources really stress the organized nature. They have supply networks. They use motherships to launch attacks further offshore.
Motherships, like bigger boats they operate from.
Yeah, exactly. And their violence, kidnapping, torture, shooting crew members, it's described as, well, almost a deliberate business model.
A business model based on terror.
Pretty much to
Yeah.
get what they want. The reported incidents shot up. The IMO figures went from 45 in 2010 to 120 in 2012.
And that's just the reported ones.
Right. Everyone assumes many more go unreported.
What about the economic impact?
Huge. The sources mention things like trade through Benin's main port dropping by like 70% in 2012 because of the danger.
70%, wow.
And the overall cost to the region estimated at around $2 billion a year back then. By late 2013, it was the third worst spot globally for attacks.
Okay, let's shift over to the Indian Ocean. Somalia. This is the one probably most people think of when they hear modern piracy.
Exactly. This really blew up as a major concern around 2005, directly linked to the chaos from the Somali Civil War.
And the effect on shipping was massive.
Immediate and huge, yeah. Especially the costs. Annual losses were estimated in the billions. The sources cite figures between $6.6 and $6.9 billion a year.
Billion with a B.
Wow. And an interesting side effect the sources mention, this created what they call an industry of profiteers.
Profiteers? Like who?
Yeah. Primarily insurance companies. With the risk skyrocketing, premiums went way up and their profits increased significantly.
Huh. Didn't think of that angle.
Yeah.
But the sources also talk about a big success story here in terms of reducing attacks.
Oh, a major success story. There's a big international naval effort, Combined Task Force 150.
Multinational Navy Group.
Yeah, they set up specific patrol areas, the Maritime Security Patrol area. And the results, according to the sources, were pretty dramatic.
That's dramatic.
By late 2012, attacks hit a 6-year low. And get this, by December 2013, attacks were around 90% compared to 2012. Only 9 attacks reported and 0 successful hijackings that year.
90%. That's incredible. How did they do it? What did the sources say worked?
It wasn't just one thing, which is key. The material points to a combination.
Okay.
Ship owners and crews got much better at using best management practices, basically, ways to make their ships harder targets.
Like what? Barbed wire, lookouts?
Stuff like that, yeah. Plus, the widespread use of armed private security guards on board became really common.
right? Guards on the ships themselves.
Then you had the big naval presence, the international forces actively patrolling, and also, importantly, efforts to build up security forces on land in Somalia.
So a multi-layered approach. On the ship, in the water, and on shore.
Exactly. It took all of those working together.
Okay, so different region again,
Yeah.
the Strait of Malacca, another really vital shipping lane.
And one with a very long history of piracy, going way back.
How do the sources describe the pirates there? Different from the Gulf of Guinea.
Generally, yes. Typically armed, guns, knives, machetes. They often attack at night, targeting ships that are either moving or anchored. But an interesting detail the sources mention is that they often back off if the crew sounds an alarm.
So maybe less confrontational, more opportunistic.
Seems that way compared to the Gulf of Guinea games, yeah. And attacks in the nearby Singapore Straits are apparently similar.
But even though Somali piracy was dropping, the sources say Malacca actually saw a spike around 2013.
It did, yeah. By mid-November 2013, the material suggests incidents there had hit a global high, actually more frequent than the Gulf of Guinea at that specific time.
Wow. So shifts around. Okay, last main area the sources cover, the Sulu and Celebes Seas.
Right. This is a big, sprawling maritime region described as porous, lots of islands, and it's been a hot spot for illegal stuff, smuggling, banditry for centuries, even before colonial times.
And the main issue there now, what kind of piracy?
According to the sources, the biggest problem recently hasn't been so much cargo theft, but abducting crew members.
Kidnapping for ransom.
Exactly. And a lot of these incidents are blamed on a specific group, the violent extremist group Abu Sayyaf. The sources mention RIA's Ape ISC, that's the Regional Anti-Piracy Cooperation Body for Asia.
Okay.
They reported 86 abductions in that area just between March 2016 and whenever the source material was compiled. Ships were being warned about the risk.
So that adds another layer of piracy linked directly to terrorism and extremist groups.
Yeah, yet another distinct motivation and method in the modern picture.
Okay, we've kind of mapped out the geography and the different styles, but to really get a feel for it, let's talk about some specific incidents the sources mention. They make it very concrete.
Absolutely. These stories really show the human side, the danger, and the variety of situations.
Like that Inabukwa one back in 2001.
Yeah, that was quite a story. Pirates hijack the ship, steal over $2 million worth of cargo, and then just maroon the crew on an island.
Stranded them.
Yeah, but the good news there was the ship was eventually found and the pirates were caught later.
Okay, contrast that with the violence mentioned in another 2001 incident, the Marine Universal off Nigeria.
That one's just tragic. A sailor taken hostage and then actually thrown overboard. It really underscores the potential for extreme brutality.
Definitely. And then the one everyone probably knows, Maersk, Alabama, 2009, the Captain Phillips movie.
Right. That really put Somali piracy on the map for the global public, didn't it?
It did.
Pirates board this huge container ship, end up taking the captain hostage in a small lifeboat.
And the U.S. Navy SEALs got involved.
Yeah, very dramatic rescue. Captain Phillips was saved, and the lead pirate was captured, eventually convicted.
There was also an attack on a cruise ship mentioned, the MSC Melody, in 2009.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because the sources specifically note they had an Israeli security team on board, contracted security. And when the pirates attacked, the security team returned fire, and that was apparently enough to deter the pirates. They broke off the attack.
Shows the impact of having security right there.
Exactly, a deterrent effect.
But then there's a really heartbreaking one, the SY Quest incident in 2011. It shows things can go terribly wrong.
That was awful. 4 American civilians on a yacht taken hostage by Somali pirates.
And the U.S. Navy was nearby.
They were closing in, yeah. And the pirates killed all 4 hostages.
Oh, God.
The sources point out this was actually unusual for Somali pirates at the time. Their usual model was ransom for the people and the ship. This deviation was tragic and highlighted just how dangerous and unpredictable these situations could become.
Bringing it right up to date, the sources mentioned 2 incidents from just November 2023. In the context of the Gaza war, interestingly.
Yes, it shows how these things are connected to wider geopolitical events. First, the Galaxy Leader. It's a vehicle carrier ship.
What happened?
Hijacked in the Red Sea by Yemen's Houthi forces. They landed a helicopter on it, took control.
And they claimed it was Israeli-linked.
That was their claim, yeah. The sources note Israel denied any link to the ship or its operators.
Okay, and the other recent one, the Central Park tanker.
That was also November 2023, but in the Gulf of Aden. This one involved suspected Somali pirates attempting to board a tanker.
Somali pirates still active then?
Apparently so. The sources say the USS Mason, a U.S. Navy destroyer, responded to the distress call.
Yeah.
They helped secure the tanker, and they actually captured 5 pirates involved in the attack.
So even with the big drop-off in Somali piracy, the threat isn't completely gone.
It seems not. It's a reminder it can flare up.
Okay, so pulling all this together, wow. Modern piracy is incredibly diverse, isn't it?
It really is, not just one thing in one place.
You've got stuff happening in coastal waters, on lakes, major shipping lanes, these complex island areas.
And the reasons behind it are just as varied. You know, from sheer economic desperation, like those fishermen we talked about,
Right.
to highly organized criminal gangs after specific valuable cargo like oil,
Or kidnapping crews.
or even acts linked to, terrorism or regional conflicts like the Houthis.
Methods are all over the place, too. Some guys back off if an alarm sounds. Others use extreme violence, torture, kidnapping, even targeted killings.
It's a constantly shifting picture. Very dynamic.
So for you listening, maybe you're nowhere near an ocean. Why should you care about all this? What's the relevance?
Well, it hits the global economy, and that eventually affects pretty much everyone.
How?
Think about it. If shipping routes are disrupted, it means delays. It means higher costs for transport.
Insurance goes up.
Insurance premiums definitely go up. Companies spend more on security. Maybe they have to take longer, safer routes. All those costs, they eventually get passed down the supply chain.
To us, the consumers.
Ultimately, yes. And beyond the money, as we've heard in these examples, there's a very real, often terrible human cost for the seafarers out there just trying to do their jobs.
Yeah. Definitely not just a historical footnote then. It's current, it's complex, and it has real impact.
Absolutely. Very much so.
So as we've kind of unpacked today, piracy in the 21st century, it's this really complex global issue. It's shaped by, well, everything from local poverty and instability to big organized crime, even politics and extremist groups.
Yeah, the picture you get from these sources is of pirates who are incredibly adaptable. They change targets, they change locations, they change methods based on, what works and how security forces respond.
Right. So given how adaptable they are and how much this seems tied to really difficult problems on shore, poverty, weak governments, crime networks, it makes you wonder, what's the future for trying to combat this?
It really does. And maybe the more provocative thought to leave you with, something the sources make you consider, how effective can just focusing on security at sea really be?
And the root causes are so often on land.
Exactly. How effective can maritime security alone be against these really deep, complex challenges? That's something to think about.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission is always the same. Take a stack of material today, a really comprehensive article, and pull out the most important insights, the surprising facts, and, well, help you cut through the noise.
And today we're diving into a word that means a lot to everyone, carries immense weight and complexity. Cancer.
Yeah.
It's not just one thing, but a whole group of diseases.
Exactly. It's complex, it's multifaceted. So what did our deep dive into this source reveal about cancer? We're going to unpack what it is, look at its surprising history,
Right.
understand how it develops and what drives it, how it's detected and treated, and even touch on its profound impact on society and culture.
Think of this as us guiding you through the core understanding and the key takeaways from this material. We're here to make sure you get the essential knowledge without, getting lost in the weeds.
Okay, let's jump right in. We're talking about cancer. Where did that name even come from? Our source starts with a great little historical detail.
It does. The word cancer traces back to the ancient Greek word karkinos, which means crab.
Crab? Really?
Yeah, early physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, they saw a resemblance between some hard tumors with swollen veins and, well, the shape of a crab.
Like the legs reaching out from the body. Huh. That's a vivid image.
It is. And the English word cancer started being used in this medical sense around the 1600s. So yeah, a visual likeness was the original link.
Okay, that's the history. But the core definition today, it's about abnormal cell growth, right?
It is. Cells that don't behave normally and crucially have the potential to invade nearby tissue or spread to other parts of the body.
That's spread. That's metastasis.
That's metastasis, exactly.
Right. And that ability to invade and spread is the critical difference compared to benign tumors. Benign ones might grow, but they stay put. Malignant ones go rogue.
Precisely. And the source outlines what researchers often call the hallmarks of cancer. These are the fundamental traits that make a malignant tumor what it is.
Okay, like what?
Things like constantly telling themselves to grow, ignoring signals that would normally stop cell,
Signals, yeah.
avoiding programmed cell death, basically. They've learned how to be immortal and just keep dividing endlessly.
Well,
They also promote new blood vessel growth to feed themselves. That's angiogenesis. They can invade, and of course, they can metastasize.
so it's a whole suite of rule-breaking behaviors.
Yeah,
And it takes more than just one thing going wrong. It's not like flipping a single switch.
absolutely not. The material emphasizes that it's typically a multi-step process. It requires the accumulation of multiple genetic changes for a normal cell to become fully malignant. It's malignant progression over time.
Multiple steps, compounding problems. Got it. So if this is abnormal growth, what are the signs and symptoms you might actually see? Our source points out that often it starts silently.
That's right. Symptoms usually only become noticeable when the growing mass starts causing issues, maybe pressing on organs, blocking passages, or breaking through the surface, ulcerating.
And because the symptoms can be so varied and nonspecific, cancer is sometimes called, what was it, a great imitator.
That's the term, yeah. Which makes early diagnosis incredibly challenging.
I bet. What kind of symptoms are common then?
Well, there are local symptoms tied directly to the tumor's location. So if it's in the lung, it might block an airway, leading to a persistent cough or maybe pneumonia.
Okay.
In the colon, it could change bowel habits or cause a blockage. Or sometimes it might just be an observable lump, like in the breast or testicle.
Is pain usually an early warning sign? People often think of cancer and pain together.
The source notes that localized pain is typically a sign of more advanced cancer. The initial tumor itself is often painless.
Okay.
But ulceration can lead to bleeding. That might show up as coughing up blood or blood in the stool, or even anemia from slow chronic blood loss.
Okay, so local effects depending on location. What about symptoms that affect the whole body? Systemic symptoms.
Those include things like general fatigue that just doesn't go away with rest, unexplained weight loss, changes to the skin, or persistent fever. Some cancers can also lead to something called cachexia.
Cachexia.
Yeah, it's a severe loss of muscle mass and strength, real wasting.
And the source mentioned something called paraneoplastic syndromes. That sounds complicated.
Yes, these are fascinating and sometimes really bewildering. They're systemic effects caused not by the tumor directly invading, but by substances like hormones or molecules released by the tumor that affect distant parts of the body.
Like what kind of effects?
You might see things like altered mental state, severe constipation, headaches, or even seizures. And it's not because the tumor is in the brain or the gut necessarily.
Right.
It's because the tumor is producing something, maybe a hormone, that's disrupting, say, calcium levels or sodium levels system-wide. Shortness of breath, dyspnea is also common, and that can be caused by the tumor itself, or fluid buildup, or even reactions to treatment.
So many different ways it can manifest. You mentioned metastasis earlier, the spread. The source highlights something really critical about that, didn't it?
It did. It states pretty unequivocally that most cancer deaths are due to cancer that has metastasized.
Most deaths.
Yes. The spread to other locations, forming metastatic tumors distant from where it started, the primary site.
That's a really stark fact. So while treating the primary tumor is vital, controlling or preventing that spread is often the biggest battle.
Yeah.
How does that process actually happen? How do cells spread?
The source outlines the typical steps. First, the cancer cells invade the tissue immediately surrounding them. Then they have to get into the transport system, the bloodstream or the lymphatic system.
Okay.
They circulate through the body. Then they have to get out again into new tissue that's called extravasation. They start proliferating there. And then they promote new blood vessel growth, angiogenesis again, to sustain themselves in this new home.
It's quite a journey for a cell. And certain cancers are more likely to spread to particular organs.
Generally, yes, there are patterns, though overall the source mentions the most common sites for metastasis are the lungs, liver, brain, and bones. And while early detection can cure many localized cancers, metastatic cancer is usually much harder to treat, although thankfully we are seeing significant advances in treatments for metastatic disease now.
That's hopeful. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about what actually causes these cells to become abnormal and grow uncontrollably in the first place. Our deep dive revealed a really powerful statistic about causes.
It did. It's quite striking, actually. It shows that the vast majority of cancers, something like 90 to 95% of cases, are believed to be due to genetic mutations driven primarily by environmental and lifestyle factors.
90 to 95%, so only a small fraction is purely inherited.
That's right. Only about 5 to 10% are primarily caused by inherited genetics passed down through families.
And when we say environmental, it's a broad term here, isn't it? Not just like pollution.
Exactly. The material defines environmental very broadly. It includes lifestyle choices, diet, physical activity, smoking, alcohol, but also behavior, socioeconomic factors, and external exposures like pollution or radiation. It's a wide net.
So, many factors we potentially have some control over. Let's start with the one the source highlights as the biggest lifestyle factor: tobacco.
Tobacco use is just monumental in its impact. It's the cause of about 90% of lung cancer deaths.
90%.
And it's responsible for roughly 1 in 5 cancer deaths globally, and even higher, about 1 in 3 in the developed world.
1 in 3 cancer deaths in developed countries linked to tobacco. That statistic is chilling.
It is. And it's not just lung cancer. It causes cancers of the mouth, throat, esophagus, bladder, kidney, pancreas. The list goes on.
Why is it so bad?
Tobacco smoke contains over 50 known carcinogens, like nitrosamines. Our source points out something really clear. Lung cancer death rates in the U.S. over time have mirrored the patterns of cigarette smoking almost exactly.
A very clear cause and effect there. So avoiding tobacco is absolutely paramount for prevention. What about diet and physical activity?
Well, diet, inactivity, and obesity are together linked to a substantial portion, possibly up to 30 to 35% of cancer deaths.
30 to 35%, that's huge too.
It is. Excess body weight, obesity, is tied to increased risk for numerous cancer types. One UK study mentioned linked higher BMI to at least 10 different cancers. And physical inactivity plays a role too.
Is the diet link mostly about not eating enough fruits and vegetables, or is it about eating too much overall?
That's an interesting point the source brings up. It notes one viewpoint suggests that perhaps more than half of the dietary effect on cancer risk is due to overnutrition, simply consuming too many calories, rather than just insufficient intake of protective foods like fruits and vegetables.
That perspective is a bit different from what you sometimes hear. Are there specific foods or substances highlighted as particularly risky?
Yes, a few key ones. A high-salt diet is linked to gastric cancer. There's a common mold contaminant called aflatoxin B1 found on improperly stored food like peanuts or corn, which is a potent cause of liver cancer.
Aflatoxin, right.
Chewing doodle nut is strongly linked to oral cancer in parts of Asia, and processed and red meat consumption is associated with increased risk for breast, colon, and pancreatic cancer.
Why the meat link?
Potentially because of carcinogenic compounds that can form when meat, especially red or processed meat, is cooked at high temperatures. The source even uses the example of immigrants' cancer profiles changing over time after moving their cancer patterns start to match their new country's patterns, which really emphasizes the strength of these environmental and dietary factors.
That's a powerful illustration. Okay, what about alcohol?
Alcohol consumption clearly increases the risk for a range of cancers. That includes breast, throat, liver, esophagus, mouth, larynx, and colon cancers.
And workplace exposures. You hear about asbestos.
Yes, workplace exposures can contribute to a significant number of cases. The estimates vary, maybe 2 to 20%. Asbestos inhalation causing mesothelioma is the classic example.
Right.
But also exposure to chemicals like benzene, which is linked to leukemia, or even certain medications handled in healthcare settings, like some chemotherapy drugs. The source specifically mentions PFOA, a chemical used in Teflon production, being linked to kidney cancer.
Okay, so those environmental and lifestyle factors account for the vast majority, that 90-95%. What about the remaining 5 to 10%, the inherited part?
That's where inherited genetic defects come in. While it's actually less than 0.3% of the population who carry specific mutations with a large effect on cancer risk.
Okay, so it's rare to have those really high-risk genes.
Relatively rare, yes. But overall, these inherited changes contribute to about 3 to 10% of cancers. Classic examples are inheriting mutations in the BRCA1 or BRCA2 genes.
The breast cancer genes.
Exactly, which dramatically increase the risk of breast and ovarian cancer, or inheriting genes linked to Lynch syndrome, which significantly increases colorectal cancer risk, among others.
So if you have a family history, does that mean you're destined to get cancer?
Not at all, but it does increase your relative risk compared to someone without that specific history. The source gives some specific numbers. Having a first-degree relative, like a parent or sibling, with colorectal cancer roughly doubles your risk.
Doubles, okay.
For lung cancer, it's about 1.5 times the risk. For prostate cancer, about 1.9 times higher. For breast cancer, the increased risk varies depending on how old your relative was when they were diagnosed.
Right, that makes sense. And here's a totally counterintuitive fact the source mentions. Taller people have an increased risk of cancer. What's that about?
That is surprising, isn't it? Our source explains it quite simply, really. Taller people just have more cells than shorter people.
More cells. More chances for something to go wrong.
Basically, yes. Since height is largely determined by genetics, this represents a kind of heritable increase in risk simply because having more cells gives you statistically more opportunities for one of those cells to accumulate the damaging mutations needed to start a cancer over your lifetime.
Huh. More cells, more lottery tickets for a bad mutation. Fascinating. What about physical agents causing cancer? Is that different from chemicals?
This category refers to things that cause cancer through physical irritation or damage rather than a direct chemical reaction. The prime example is prolonged inhalation of asbestos fibers.
Right, mesothelioma.
Exactly. The fibers lodge in the lungs and cause chronic inflammation and eventually cancer. Other fibers, like wollastonite or glass wool, and certain non-fibrous materials like powdered cobalt or nickel, can also be carcinogenic if there's prolonged exposure and they get inside the body.
And physical trauma, like if you get hit hard somewhere, can that cause cancer?
The source states that simple, single physical trauma causing cancer is actually rare and often unproven in many common claims. However, repeated, chronic physical damage can increase risk.
Like what?
Examples mentioned are repeated burns or exposure to scalding heat, like maybe habitually drinking very hot tea, which has been linked to skin or esophageal cancer in some populations. And this often ties into the hypothesis that chronic inflammation—
inflammation again.
Yes, whether it's from repeated injury, infection, or other sources, chronic inflammation might either directly cause mutations over time, or it could create a microenvironment around cells that promotes their proliferation and migration, basically helping cancer develop or spread.
Inflammation as a driver, that seems to be a recurring theme. What role do hormones play?
Hormones are significant, particularly in cancers linked to the reproductive system, so breast, prostate, endometrial, ovarian cancers.
How do they contribute?
They primarily act by promoting cell proliferation, making cells divide more often. Insulin-like growth factors are also key players in this. The source gives examples like daughters of breast cancer patients tending to have higher levels of estrogen and progesterone, or population differences. Men of African ancestry tend to have higher testosterone levels, which correlates with their higher rates of prostate cancer, compared to men of Asian ancestry who tend to have lower levels and lower rates.
So hormone levels aren't just correlated, they can actively drive cell growth in susceptible tissues.
Exactly. And this connects back to lifestyle factors, too. Things like obesity and using hormone replacement therapy can lead to higher circulating hormone levels, potentially increasing the risk of these hormone-associated cancers. Conversely, exercise is often linked to lower hormone levels and reduced risk.
Right. It all connects. And finally, our source mentions a link between autoimmune diseases and cancer risk. How does that work?
There is an association. For instance, untreated celiac disease is linked to an increased risk of overall cancers, a risk that goes down significantly once treatment with a gluten-free diet is adopted. And chronic inflammatory conditions like Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis are well known to increase the risk of gastrointestinal cancers, specifically in the inflamed areas of the bowel.
Because of the chronic inflammation again?
Likely, yes. But the source also adds a layer of complexity. Treatments for some autoimmune diseases, particularly immunosuppressants, might actually increase the risk of other cancers, those outside the intestinal tract.
A difficult balance there. Okay, that's a really comprehensive look at the causes of the complex interplay of environment, lifestyle, genetics, inflammation, hormones. Now let's dive into how cancer actually develops at the cellular and genetic level. The forest frames it as fundamentally a disease of messed up tissue growth regulation.
It is. At its very heart, cancer involves alterations in the genes that control how our cells grow, divide, and, do their jobs. You have oncogenes.
The accelerators.
Exactly. They're like accelerators promoting growth. And then you have tumor suppressor genes, which are the brakes inhibiting growth.
Right.
Malignant transformation happens when these genes get altered. Maybe an oncogene becomes hyperactive, gets stuck in the on position, or a tumor suppressor gene gets disabled, the brakes fail.
And as we established, it's usually not just one single change needed.
Correct. Typically, multiple genetic changes have to accumulate within a single cell lineage over time to fully transform it into a cancer cell.
What kind of changes are we talking about?
They can be big or small. You can have gains or losses of entire chromosomes. Large chunks of DNA can be deleted or duplicated, amplified. Chromosomes can swap pieces, that's translocation, like the famous Philadelphia chromosome seen in chronic myelogenous leukemia.
Yeah.
Or you can have smaller changes, like tiny point mutations, single-letter changes in the DNA code, or small insertions and deletions. Even viruses inserting their own genetic material into our DNA can disrupt critical genes.
So errors happen during normal cell division, but usually they're caught.
Yes, cell replication is incredibly complex, and mistakes, mutations happen spontaneously just through the process of copying DNA. But our bodies have really sophisticated error correction and DNA repair systems.
Okay.
And we also have built-in mechanisms like programmed cell death, apoptosis, to basically tell a cell to self-destruct if it's too damaged to repair.
So the problem arises when those systems fail.
Exactly. The problem is when these repair and control systems themselves get damaged, perhaps by exposure to carcinogens or chronic inflammation or radiation. This increases the rate of errors beyond what the systems can handle, or the systems themselves become faulty.
And the source describes how these errors can actually self-amplify, become compounding.
This is where it gets really interesting and frankly quite scary from a biological perspective. An initial genetic error, say, a mutation in a gene responsible for DNA repair doesn't just sit there. It makes future errors more likely.
Because the repair kit is broken.
Right. Or a mutation that makes a cell divide just slightly faster means it has more chances, more generations, to pick up additional mutations. If those new mutations disable a tumor suppressor or activate an oncogene, the process accelerates further.
Like a snowball effect.
Precisely. The source describes it almost like an evolutionary process within the body, an undesirable survival of the fittest, or a rebellion-like scenario, where cellular evolution is actually working against the host organism. This process leads to what's called clonal evolution, where different populations of cells within the tumor accumulate different sets of mutations, leading to significant heterogeneity within the tumor itself.
So the cancer cells are literally evolving to become better and better at being cancer cells. And this links back directly to those hallmarks you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. These accumulated genetic changes are what ultimately confer those hallmark abilities onto the cancer cells. The ability to evade programmed death, apoptosis, to achieve self-sufficiency in growth signals, to become insensitive to anti-growth signals, to promote blood vessel growth, angiogenesis, to gain limitless replicative potential, to invade tissues and metastasize, to reprogram their metabolism, and even to evade destruction by the immune system.
It's a formidable set of acquired skills. Our source also puts a lot of emphasis on something called epigenetics, working alongside genetics. What is that exactly?
Epigenetics refers to changes that affect gene expression, whether a gene is turned on or off, without actually changing the underlying DNA sequence itself.
So not changing the letters in the book, but maybe highlighting them or sticking pages together.
That's a great analogy. Think of it as changing how easily that book is opened and read, or which chapters are accessible. Common epigenetic mechanisms include DNA methylation, adding chemical tags to DNA, or modifications to histone proteins, which are the spools DNA wraps around. These changes can switch genes on or off.
And these epigenetic alterations are common in cancers.
Very common. And they are particularly important because they frequently affect genes involved in, guess what?
Let me guess. DNA repair.
Exactly, DNA repair genes. If these crucial repair genes are epigenetically silenced, turned off by these epigenetic modifications, the cell becomes deficient at fixing DNA damage.
Which leads to more mutations.
Yes. It leads to a much higher rate of both new DNA mutations and new epigenetic errors. It creates a vicious cycle, a feedback loop.
So epigenetic changes can cripple the repair system, leading to a cascade of actual genetic problems. That connects the two.
Yes, it directly links genetic instability and epigenetic instability. While inheriting DNA repair defects can cause high cancer risk, the source points out that many sporadic cancers, those not primarily inherited, often have repair deficiencies because these key repair genes are epigenetically shut down, not necessarily mutated themselves.
That's a key distinction.
And it notes that cancers usually arise from a complex combination of both mutations and epimutations. Some studies even suggest that these functional epigenetic alterations might be even more frequent than the protein-altering DNA mutations that researchers traditionally focused on.
It's clearly a complex interplay of genetic and epigenetic changes driving things. The source also briefly touches on how cancer cells change their metabolism, something known as the Warburg effect.
Right. It's a fascinating shift. Many cancers fundamentally change how they produce energy.
Yeah.
A lot of them become heavily reliant on glycolysis breaking down glucose, even when there's plenty of oxygen available.
Which is weird, right? Because glycolysis is less efficient than the normal way cells make energy with oxygen.
It is less efficient in terms of ATP yield per glucose molecule. Yes, that's the Warburg effect. Normal cells typically switch to the much more efficient oxidative phosphorylation when oxygen is present, but cancer cells often stick with glycolysis. The reasons are complex, but it might provide building blocks needed for rapid growth.
Are there exceptions?
Yes, definitely. The source mentions some lymphomas or leukemias, for example, that still rely heavily on oxidative phosphorylation. And some cancers also heavily utilize other fuel sources, like the amino acid glutamine, which is particularly important for building new DNA and RNA needed for rapidly dividing cells.
So they essentially rewire their energy production machinery to support that out-of-control growth. Okay, after understanding what cancer is and how it develops, let's talk about diagnosis. Our source is very clear about what's required for a definitive diagnosis.
Absolutely. While signs, symptoms, or screening tests like blood tests or imaging might strongly suggest cancer, a definitive diagnosis requires examining the actual tissue.
Meaning a biopsy.
Exactly. Taking a biopsy, a small sample of the suspicious tissue, and having a pathologist, a specialist doctor, look at the cells under a microscope. That's the gold standard.
So, x-rays, CT scans, blood work that can point you in the right direction, raise suspicion, but you need that tissue sample for confirmation.
Precisely. And the tissue diagnosis is crucial because it doesn't just confirm cancer. It tells you exactly what type of cancer it is, how abnormal or aggressive the cells look, that's the grade, and sometimes can even reveal specific genetic abnormalities within the tumor cells.
And all that information helps guide treatment.
Immensely. It's vital for figuring out the likely prognosis and choosing the best, most effective treatment plan. Other specialized tests, like cytogenetics, which looks at chromosomes, or immunohistochemistry, which uses antibodies to detect specific proteins, can provide even more detailed molecular information about the tumor.
And the source rightly highlights the huge psychological impact of receiving a cancer diagnosis. It's not just a physical disease.
It's immense, a life-changing moment for most people. The material mentions that psychosocial interventions, things like counseling, support groups, are really important for helping patients and their families cope with the distress, the fear, the uncertainty.
It also brings up a sensitive point about cultural differences in how a diagnosis is actually disclosed, how the news is shared.
Yes, this is really important. While Western medical culture tends to strongly emphasize full disclosure directly to the patient, enabling shared decision-making.
Right, patient autonomy.
Exactly. Many other cultures, perhaps historically in parts of Africa, Asia, and South America, have different approaches. Sometimes disclosure is slower, less direct, or the family plays a much larger role in deciding how much information the patient receives, sometimes even choosing to shield the patient from a particularly grim prognosis.
To protect them from distress.
Potentially, yes. Practices are evolving globally towards more open communication, but it's a powerful reminder that there isn't one single right way to handle this difficult news, and cultural context matters hugely in healthcare communication.
Absolutely. Once diagnosed, how is cancer typically classified? You mentioned the pathologist identifies the type.
Cancers are generally classified based on the type of cell they most closely resemble, which is presumed to be their cell of origin. The major categories are carcinoma, which arise from epithelial cells, the cells lining surfaces and glands. These are the most common type, including most breast, lung, prostate, and colon cancers.
Okay, carcinoma. What else?
Then there's sarcoma, which arises from connective tissues like bone, cartilage, fat, muscle, or nerves. Lymphoma and leukemia arise from blood-forming cells in the bone marrow or lymph nodes.
Right.
Germ cell tumors arise from pluripotent cells, usually in the testicles or ovaries. And finally, blastoma, which are cancers derived from immature or embryonic-like precursor cells, often seen in children.
And their names usually reflect that origin, like adenocarcinoma.
Yes, often. You'll see suffixes like lanocarcinoma or sarcoma or blastoma. Adenocarcinoma specifically refers to a carcinoma arising from glandular epithelial cells. Benign tumors, in contrast, often just end in the suffix -oma, like fibroma or lipoma. Though confusingly, there are a few exceptions like melanoma or seminoma, which sound benign but are actually malignant.
Always exceptions. Okay, so the cell type is fundamental to the classification. Moving on to prevention, our source seems quite positive about the potential here, given all those lifestyle and environmental factors we discussed.
It does. It reiterates that because most cancers, perhaps 70 to 90% of common ones, are driven by these environmental risk factors, they are therefore potentially preventable through changes in lifestyle and environment.
That statistic is incredibly hopeful, really. What are the biggest preventable factors the source emphasizes, again, for prevention?
Top of the list, avoiding tobacco use. Then maintaining a healthy body weight and avoiding obesity. Eating a balanced diet, being physically active, limiting alcohol consumption, preventing certain infections known to cause cancer, and reducing exposure to environmental pollutants like air pollution.
And poverty was mentioned as an indirect factor.
Yes, likely because poverty influences exposure to many of these risk factors. Diet, smoking rates, access to health care, environmental exposures. A global burden of disease analysis cited in the material showed that around 44% of cancer deaths back in 2019 were attributable to preventable risk factors like smoking, alcohol use, and high BMI.
Almost half. So individual choices and public health efforts focusing on these areas could make a massive difference. On the diet piece specifically, the source notes some conflicting evidence on particular recommendations, right? It's not always straightforward.
It does highlight that complexity.
Right.
But it emphasizes the primary dietary factors that are most clearly linked to increased risk: obesity, driven by excess calorie intake, and excessive alcohol consumption.
Okay.
While things like low fruit and vegetable intake or high red meat consumption have certainly been implicated, the source mentions that meta-analyses looking at all the studies together sometimes show inconsistent or less strong evidence compared to, say, tobacco or obesity.
So maybe less focus on finding one specific superfood to prevent cancer.
Right.
And more focus on overall healthy weight, avoiding excessive alcohol, and definitely limiting processed and red meat, which still seems to be flagged.
Yes. Processed and red meat are consistently flagged as concerning. So based on the source's summary of the evidence, focusing on avoiding obesity, limiting alcohol, and reducing processed red meat seems to be the key takeaway for dietary prevention. Though typical recommendations still generally include emphasizing vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and fish, while limiting those problematic items, animal fats, pickled foods, and refined carbohydrates.
Makes sense. What about using medications specifically to prevent cancer? Is that a viable strategy?
In certain specific high-risk situations, yes, it can be. For example, NSAIDs like aspirin can reduce colorectal cancer risk, although for average-risk individuals, the potential harms like bleeding often outweigh the benefits for general prevention.
But aspirin showed some promise.
Yes, some studies suggest regular low-dose aspirin might reduce the risk of death from several common cancers by around 7% in certain populations. Medications like tamoxifen or raloxifene can significantly reduce breast cancer risk in women identified as high risk. And there are drugs like finasteride, sometimes considered for prostate cancer risk reduction, though the overall benefit versus harm balance there isn't fully clear according to the source.
Okay, so targeted use in high-risk cases. What about vitamin supplements? Can popping a multivitamin help prevent cancer?
The source is pretty definitive here. Generally, vitamin supplementation does not appear effective for cancer prevention based on current evidence from large trials.
Really? Not even vitamin D?
While low vitamin D levels in the blood might be correlated with higher cancer risk in observational studies, trials giving people vitamin D supplements haven't convincingly shown a benefit in preventing cancer. And worryingly, some supplements might even be harmful. Yes, beta-carotene supplements were famously shown to actually increase the risk of lung cancer in high-risk individuals like smokers. Folic acid supplements weren't effective for preventing colon cancer and might even increase the growth of existing polyps. Selenium hasn't panned out either.
Okay, so don't rely on a pill for prevention. But vaccines are a completely different story, right?
Absolutely. Vaccines that prevent infection by specific carcinogenic viruses are highly effective and crucial prevention tools. The HPV vaccine.
Human papillomavirus.
Right. It significantly reduces the risk of cervical cancer, as well as other cancers caused by HPV, like throat, anal, and penile cancers. And the hepatitis B vaccine dramatically lowers the risk of liver cancer caused by chronic HBV infection.
So these are really important public health measures.
Definitely. The source strongly recommends their administration wherever resources allow. They are true cancer prevention tools.
Prevention is powerful. But if cancer does develop, early detection through screening is key. How does our source distinguish screening from regular diagnostic tests?
It's a key distinction. Screening is specifically about looking for cancer before any symptoms appear in people who feel perfectly healthy. Diagnostic tests, on the other hand, are done when someone has symptoms to figure out the cause.
Okay. And screening can involve different methods.
Yes, it could be a physical exam, blood or urine tests looking for markers, or imaging tests like mammograms or CT scans.
And importantly, not all cancers have recommended screening tests or tests that are suitable for everyone.
Correct. The decision to implement a screening program for a particular cancer in a population or recommend it for an individual involves a really careful weighing of potential benefits against potential risks, harms, and costs.
What factors go into that calculation?
You have to consider things like, is the test accurate? Does it have potential harms itself, like radiation exposure? How likely is it that someone in the screen group actually has the cancer screening for very rare cancers isn't efficient? What are the harms from follow-up procedures if the screening test is positive? False positives can lead to anxiety and unnecessary invasive tests. Does finding the cancer early actually improve the outcome? Is there effective treatment? And critically, is there a risk of overdiagnosis?
Overdiagnosis, finding cancers that wouldn't have ever caused a problem.
Exactly. Finding very slow-growing cancers, particularly in older people, that would never have caused symptoms or shortened their life if left undetected. This leads to overtreatment, anxiety, and cost without real benefit. You also have to consider if the test is acceptable to people and the overall cost effectiveness.
It's a complex balance.
Yeah.
What are some of the specific recommendations mentioned by the source, particularly from the USPSTF in the U.S.?
The source refers to recommendations from the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. They strongly recommend cervical cancer screening, for example, using pap smears and/or HPV testing. They also recommend colorectal cancer screening using various methods like colonoscopy or stool tests, typically starting at age 50, though sometimes earlier now.
Okay, cervical and colorectal are recommended. What about others?
For several others, like skin cancer, oral cancer, lung cancer, except in specific high-risk smokers, or prostate cancer in men under 75, the USPSTF finds insufficient evidence to make a firm recommendation for or against routine screening in the general population. And they actively recommend against routine screening for cancers of the bladder, testicles, ovaries, or pancreas, and also against general prostate cancer screening using PSA in average-risk men.
What about mammography for breast cancer screening? That seems to be an area of ongoing debate, doesn't it?
It certainly is. The USPSTF currently recommends mammography every 2 years for women aged 50 to 74. However, the source also highlights that there is significant controversy. It mentions a Cochrane review, which is a highly respected independent group, that concluded breast cancer screening by mammography actually had no statistically significant effect on reducing overall breast cancer mortality when considering all evidence.
No effect on mortality. Why?
They cite major concerns about overdiagnosis and overtreatment finding and treating breast cancers that would never have become life-threatening. It really underscores that the evidence base, its interpretation, and the resulting recommendations can be complex and actively debated among experts.
That's surprising. And genetic testing plays a role in screening, but only for certain high-risk groups.
Yes, absolutely. For individuals identified as being at significantly increased risk, often due to a strong family history or specific ancestry known to carry certain mutations, genetic testing for genes like BRCA1 and BRCA2 or the genes linked to Lynch syndrome is often recommended.
And if they carry a mutation?
Finding one of these high-risk mutations allows for much more tailored and intensive surveillance plans, potentially preventive medications like tamoxifen, or even risk-reducing surgery like prophylactic mastectomy or oophorectomy.
Okay, so we've covered detection and screening. Once cancer is found, how is it typically managed? What are the primary treatment options discussed in our source?
Our source lists the mainstays of cancer treatment: surgery, chemotherapy, radiation therapy, hormonal therapy, targeted therapy, and also, importantly, palliative care.
And the choice depends on many factors.
Highly individualized. It depends crucially on the specific type and stage of the cancer, its location, the patient's overall health, their personal preferences, and very importantly, the goal of treatment. Is it aiming for a cure or is the focus on palliation, which means relieving symptoms and improving quality of life when a cure isn't possible?
Surgery seems like the most direct approach for solid tumors, right? Just cut it out.
It is the primary treatment for most localized solid cancers, yes. It's also essential for obtaining biopsies for the initial diagnosis and for determining the extent or stage of the cancer. The main goal is usually to remove the entire tumor mass, often along with nearby lymph nodes, to check for spread.
Can surgery alone be enough?
For some early-stage cancers, surgery alone can indeed be curative. It also plays a crucial role in relieving symptoms or prolonging life even in more advanced cases, for example, by removing a bowel obstruction caused by a tumor.
Okay. What about chemotherapy? That word often evokes strong images.
Chemotherapy involves using cytotoxic drugs, chemicals, specifically designed to kill rapidly dividing cells, which is a hallmark of many cancer cells. It's often given systemically, meaning it travels throughout the body.
Is it usually one drug or multiple?
Often it's given in combination regimens, using multiple different chemotherapy drugs together or in sequence. Traditional chemotherapy works broadly by targeting cell division. Combination therapy can sometimes be more effective than single drugs for improving response rates and survival for certain cancers, but the source does note that the overall impact on health outcomes, when considering the added toxicity of combinations, can sometimes be uncertain.
Targeted therapy sounds, well, more targeted. How is that different?
It is. Targeted therapy is essentially a smarter form of chemotherapy. Instead of broadly attacking all rapidly dividing cells, it focuses on specific molecular differences that are present in the cancer cells, but not, or less so, in normal cells.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Drugs that block the estrogen receptor are used in certain types of breast cancer that are fueled by estrogen. Or specific inhibitors, like those targeting the abnormal BCR-ABL protein in chronic myelogenous leukemia, CML, have revolutionized treatment for that disease. These targeted therapies exist for many common cancers now and are a major area of research.
Okay. Then there's radiation therapy. How does that work?
Radiation therapy uses high-energy ionizing radiation, like X-rays or gamma rays, to damage the DNA within cancer cells. This damage makes it impossible for them to grow, divide, and survive.
Is it targeted too?
Yes. Modern radiation therapy is highly targeted. The radiation is delivered very carefully, often using precisely shaped beams from external machines, or sometimes using radioactive sources placed directly inside or near the tumor. Brachytherapy. The goal is always to maximize the dose to the tumor while minimizing damage to surrounding healthy tissues.
How common is it?
It's used in about half of all cancer cases, often in combination with surgery or chemotherapy. It can be used with curative intent, or to shrink tumors before surgery or kill remaining cells after surgery. It's also very effective for symptom relief, like reducing pain from bone metastases.
It seems like a cornerstone of treatment.
It is. Though an interesting point from the source is that radiation therapy given after surgery for brain metastases, while often standard practice, didn't actually improve overall survival compared to just surgery alone in at least one study mentioned. So its optimal use is still being refined.
Let's talk about palliative care again. The source really emphasizes its specific goal, differentiating it from hospice.
Yes, this is a really important distinction that often gets confused. Palliative care is fundamentally about helping the patient feel better. Its primary goal is to improve quality of life by actively managing symptoms and addressing distress, whether that's physical pain, nausea, fatigue, or emotional, spiritual, and psychosocial issues.
And critically, it doesn't mean stopping treatment aimed at the cancer itself.
Exactly. That's the key difference from hospice care, which is typically for patients nearing the end of life who are no longer receiving curative treatment. Palliative care can, and often should, be provided alongside active, curative intent anti-cancer treatments right from the time of diagnosis if needed.
When is it typically recommended?
The source mentions recommendations for initiating early palliative care in patients who have distressing symptoms that are hard to control, significant difficulty coping with the diagnosis or treatment, those with metastatic disease, or anyone with a limited prognosis, say less than 12 months, even if they are still receiving active anti-cancer treatment and doing relatively well otherwise. It's about adding an extra layer of support focused on well-being.
That makes a lot of sense. What about immunotherapy? We hear so much about that these days. Is it living up to the hype?
Immunotherapy is definitely one of the most exciting and rapidly advancing frontiers in cancer treatment. It's a fundamentally different approach that focuses on harnessing or boosting the power of the patient's own immune system to recognize and fight the cancer cells.
How does it do that?
There are several different strategies. One involves using engineered antibodies called monoclonal antibodies that can flag cancer cells for destruction or block growth signals. Another major breakthrough is checkpoint inhibitor therapy.
Checkpoint inhibitors.
Yes. These drugs essentially release the natural brakes on the immune system, the checkpoints, that cancer cells sometimes exploit to hide. This allows the immune system's T cells to recognize and attack the tumor more effectively. Then there's adoptive cell transfer, like CAR-RT therapy, where a patient's own immune cells are removed, genetically engineered in the lab to better target their cancer, multiplied, and then infused back into the patient.
It sounds very personalized.
It can be, yes. Immunotherapy has led to remarkable responses in some cancers that were previously very difficult to treat, although it doesn't work for everyone, and can have its own unique side effects related to immune system overactivation.
And the source also mentions laser therapy. Is that common?
Laser therapy uses high-intensity beams of light to precisely shrink or destroy tumors or precancerous lesions. It's most commonly used for superficial cancers, like those on the skin surface, or the lining of internal organs like the cervix or throat, especially in early stages.
Advantages.
It offers high precision, potentially less bleeding, swelling, and scarring compared to traditional surgery. It's often used in combination with other treatments. There's also a technique called laser-induced interstitial thermotherapy, or LITT, which uses the laser's heat to destroy tumor tissue from within. Requires specialized training and equipment, though.
Yeah. And finally, on the treatment front, the source addresses alternative medicine. What's the stance there?
It makes a clear distinction between complementary medicine, which might be used alongside conventional medical treatment, like acupuncture for nausea, and alternative medicine, which is used instead of conventional treatment.
And the verdict on alternative therapies.
The source states quite plainly that most alternative cancer therapies have not been rigorously studied using conventional scientific methods like randomized clinical trials. It includes a powerful statement quoting that many alternative cancer therapies have been disproven through investigation, meaning they've been studied and shown not to be effective, but unfortunately, they are often still marketed to vulnerable patients.
That's a very strong warning for patients considering going outside conventional medicine. With all these treatment options, complex as they are, what does the source say about prognosis, the overall likelihood of recovery or survival?
As you'd expect, prognosis varies hugely. It depends massively on the specific type of cancer and, critically, its stage at diagnosis. Was it caught early and localized, or had it already spread?
And metastasis makes a big difference.
Almost always, yes. Metastasis significantly worsens the prognosis for most cancers. The source states that overall, about half of patients who are treated for invasive cancer will ultimately die either from the cancer itself or sometimes from complications of its treatment. And as we noted earlier, a majority of those cancer deaths are attributed to the spread of the disease, the metastases.
Are survival rates different in different parts of the world? You mentioned prevalence differs.
Yes, survival rates tend to be worse in the developing world compared to developed countries. This is partly due to the types of cancer that are more prevalent there, often being harder to treat effectively, like liver or stomach cancer, but also due to later diagnosis and less access to optimal treatments.
Does surviving one cancer affect future risk?
The source mentions that cancer survivors actually have about double the risk of developing a second, different primary cancer later in life compared to the general population. This could be due to shared underlying risk factors like smoking, the late effects of previous cancer treatments like radiation or chemo, genetic predisposition, or simply living long enough for another cancer to develop by chance.
Besides cancer type and stage, what else influences an individual's prognosis?
The patient's age and their overall health status are very important. Patients who are older or who are frail or have significant other health problems, comorbidities, generally tend to have worse prognosis, even for the same cancer type and stage.
What about mindset? Does quality of life matter?
Interestingly, the source does mention that patients who report a higher quality of life often survive longer. However, the precise causality there is complex. It's not necessarily proof that simply thinking positive cures cancer, but perhaps a higher quality of life reflects better underlying health, better coping mechanisms, better social support, or maybe it enables patients to better tolerate difficult treatments. It's likely interconnected.
That makes sense. It also notes an increased risk of blood clots in cancer patients.
Yes, cancer itself and some cancer treatments significantly increase the risk of developing blood clots in the veins, particularly deep vein thrombosis, DVT, and pulmonary embolism, PE. While blood thinners like heparin can reduce the incidence of these clots, our source notes they haven't been conclusively shown to increase overall survival in cancer patients, and they do carry an increased risk of bleeding complications.
Okay. And there's a rare, almost unbelievable phenomenon mentioned regarding prognosis.
Spontaneous remission, yes. The source notes that in extremely rare instances, certain cancers, even advanced ones, can inexplicably regress or even disappear completely on their own without any specific medical treatment known to be effective. It's very, very rare, but it is a documented biological phenomenon.
Remarkable. Just goes to show how much we still don't fully understand. Let's zoom out now and look at the bigger picture, the epidemiology of cancer. How widespread is it globally?
It's a major global health issue. Looking at recent estimates from around 2018, 2019, there are millions upon millions of new cancer cases diagnosed and millions of deaths from cancer annually worldwide. Overall, cancer accounts for about 16% of all deaths globally.
16%. That's huge. Is it worse in some parts of the world?
It's actually the leading cause of death in developed countries now, and the second leading cause in developing countries after cardiovascular disease. Interestingly, over half of all cancer cases worldwide now occur in the developing world.
And the overall number of cancer deaths globally is increasing. Why is that?
Primarily, yes, the total number is increasing. And the source explains this is largely due to two main factors. First, people are simply living longer worldwide, and age is a major risk factor. Second, there's the adoption of lifestyles associated with higher cancer risk, like increased tobacco use, dietary changes, less physical activity, in many developing countries as they become more economically developed.
You mentioned age being a major risk factor. How significant is it?
According to the source, age is perhaps the single most significant risk factor for developing most common types of invasive cancer. The vast majority of patients diagnosed are over the age of 65.
More important than smoking or diet even.
In terms of overall population risk for developing cancer, yes, age is dominant. The source includes a really powerful quote. If we live long enough, sooner or later we all would get cancer.
Wow. That really drives home how much it's linked to the accumulation of cellular damage and errors over a long lifetime. Why is age such a dominant factor?
Several reasons are cited. One is immunosenescence, the natural age-related weakening of the immune system, which becomes less effective at finding and eliminating abnormal cells. Another is simply the sheer cumulative exposure to carcinogens and the accumulation of spontaneous DNA errors over decades of cell divisions. And age-related changes in the body's hormonal and endocrine systems can also create a more permissive environment for cancer growth.
The source also mentions those very slow-growing cancers sometimes found instantly at autopsy.
Yes, that relates back to the overdiagnosis issue in screening. Things like certain types of thyroid cancer or prostate cancer are often found during autopsy in elderly individuals who died of other causes. These cancers were never detected or treated during life and clearly would never have caused them harm. It highlights that not all cancers detected through screening would necessarily become clinically significant.
What about cancer in children? Is it common?
Thankfully, cancer in children is relatively rare compared to adults. The most common types are quite different too. Leukemia, like ALL, brain tumors, and lymphomas are most frequent. While the source notes the incidence in the US and Europe might have increased slightly in recent decades for reasons that aren't fully clear, the good news is that the death rate from childhood cancer in countries like the US has decreased very significantly due to major advances in treatment.
That's great news. And the economic cost globally is huge, you said.
Enormous. The source estimated it at over $1 trillion annually worldwide a few years ago. In the U.S. alone, direct healthcare spending on cancer was around $80 billion back in 2015. But importantly, it notes that the indirect cost things like lost productivity due to illness or premature death, disability payments, and the immense cost of informal care provided by family and friends often exceed the direct medical expenses.
It's a massive burden in absolutely every sense, human, social, economic. Our source also delves into cancer's place in society and culture, starting with the widespread fear it evokes.
There's definitely intense fear and often a real taboo surrounding the word cancer. You see it in euphemisms people use, like calling it a long illness or just the C word.
Right.
The source mentions a Nigerian translation that reportedly means the disease that cannot be cured, which really reflects this deep-seated dread. It also suggests that excluding the very common but easily treatable non-melanoma skin cancers from many cancer statistics, while perhaps statistically reasonable, might inadvertently reinforce the grim public perception of cancer as almost universally fatal.
And those cultural differences we touched on earlier about how a diagnosis is shared are particularly striking in this context.
They really highlight how deeply cultural values shape this incredibly difficult experience. While the Western medical model strongly favors full open disclosure to the patient to facilitate shared decision-making and autonomy, many cultures, traditionally in parts of Africa, Asia, and South America, have opted for more gradual disclosure, or involving the family much more heavily in deciding what and when the patient is told. Sometimes, as mentioned, even withholding a particularly grim prognosis, perhaps with the intention of protecting the patient from overwhelming distress. While practices are evolving towards more disclosure globally, full prognosis disclosure certainly isn't universal yet.
It really underscores the need for cultural humility and sensitivity in healthcare communication around cancer. The source also talks about the very prevalent use of military metaphors when discussing cancer.
Yes, calling it a battle that patients fight, the war on cancer, describing tumor growth as an internal civil insurrection. This language is incredibly common.
Why do we use those metaphors?
The source posits a couple of reasons. This language might serve to emphasize the patient's agency and the need to actively combat the disease. It could also perhaps help rationalize the use of very aggressive, sometimes destructive treatments, framing them as necessary weapons in the war.
Interesting take. And it mentions a damaging but unfortunately persistent idea, the cancer personality. What was that?
This was an idea that gained some traction, maybe in the 1970s, suggesting that cancer could actually be caused by having a bad attitude, repressed emotions, or certain subconscious psychological factors. Essentially, it was blaming the victim for their illness.
That sounds awful. Is that still believed?
While that specific, crude idea is largely debunked as nonsense in the medical community today, the source notes that a diluted and incorrect form of it persists. The common belief that simply maintaining positive thinking or a fighting spirit can significantly increase a cancer patient's chances of survival.
Yeah, that's not true.
The evidence doesn't support it, and worse, this belief actually adds a huge burden to patients, making them feel anxious or guilty if they experience natural sadness, fear, or depression, worrying that their negative emotions might somehow be hindering their recovery. The writer Susan Sontag famously wrote about and critiqued this kind of psychological framing of illness.
The just world fallacy is also mentioned as a potential psychological driver for blaming or stigmatizing patients. How does that work?
Yes, this is a cognitive bias where people have an inherent need to believe that the world is fundamentally fair, that people get what they deserve. So when something bad like cancer happens to someone, this bias can lead others to subtly or overtly blame the patient. Maybe they smoked, maybe they didn't eat right, maybe they didn't fight hard enough, because that restores the observer's sense of control and safety. If I make all the right choices, it won't happen to me. It's a way of distancing oneself from the terrifying randomness of illness.
So the societal and psychological dimensions of cancer are clearly just as complex and impactful as the biological ones. Let's turn now to research. The source makes a key point right up front. Because cancer is a whole class of diseases, we shouldn't expect a single cure.
That's exactly right. Just like there's no single cure for all infectious diseases, because bacteria, viruses, fungi are all different, there won't be one single cure for all cancers. They have different origins, different mutations, different behaviors.
So things like angiogenesis inhibitors, which were once hailed as potential silver bullets.
Right. The idea was if you cut off the blood supply, all tumors would starve. But it turned out to be more complex. Now, combination therapies, often targeting multiple different pathways or vulnerabilities in the cancer cells simultaneously, are much more the norm.
What's the main focus of cancer research today?
It's multi-pronged. Researchers are still working to understand the fundamental agents and events, environmental, genetic, epigenetic, that cause the initial damage. They're trying to characterize the precise nature of that damage at the molecular level. And critically, they're studying the consequences of those changes, how they give cancer cells those hallmark abilities we discussed, how they drive tumor progression and metastasis, and how we can best target those acquired abilities with new therapies.
Has all this research over the decades led to real progress? Is the war on cancer being won?
Absolutely. There has been significant progress. The improved understanding of cancer biology has undeniably led to the development of many new and much more effective treatments since the U.S. war on cancer was officially declared back in 1971. The source notes that the overall age-adjusted cancer death rate in the U.S. has actually been declining steadily since the 1950s, reflecting improvements in prevention, screening, and especially treatment for many cancer types.
That's encouraging. But the source also points out there are still challenges in the research landscape itself.
Yes, it does mention some potential hurdles, things like intense competition for limited research funding, which might inadvertently discourage high-risk, potentially groundbreaking creative research in favor of safer, more incremental advancements. There are also ongoing challenges with ensuring research results are reproducible and addressing perverse incentives within academic institutions that can sometimes hinder rather than help rapid progress.
And the source ends the research section with a really exciting, very recent discovery, something about nanodrones.
It does. It highlights a groundbreaking 2023 discovery involving what they call NK cell-engaging nanodrones for targeted cancer treatment.
NK cells, those are natural killer immune cells,
Yes.
right?
The concept uses tiny protein cage nanoparticles, the nanodrones that are engineered to specifically attract and guide these natural killer immune cells directly to tumor sites within the body.
So using nanotechnology to basically act like a GPS, directing the body's own killer cells precisely to the cancer.
That's the idea, to concentrate the immune attack right where it's needed, on the tumor, while minimizing collateral damage to healthy tissues elsewhere. The hope is this will increase the efficacy of immunotherapy and significantly reduce the often toxic side effects associated with systemic immune activation. It's a fantastic example of cutting-edge interdisciplinary research.
Truly fascinating stuff. Okay, finally, our source touches on cancer in a couple of other important specific contexts. First, pregnancy. How common is cancer during pregnancy?
It affects about 1 in every 1,000 pregnant women, so it's not common, but not vanishingly rare either. The types of cancer most often diagnosed during pregnancy are generally the same ones common in other women of childbearing age: breast cancer, cervical cancer, lymphoma, melanoma.
Is diagnosis harder during pregnancy?
It can be, yes, because many early cancer symptoms like fatigue, nausea, changes in breasts, abdominal discomfort can easily be mistaken for normal pregnancy symptoms. This can unfortunately lead to delays in diagnosis. Also, some diagnostic imaging techniques need to be used cautiously or avoided.
Which ones are safe or unsafe?
Ultrasound is generally considered safe. MRI without contrast dye is also usually considered safe. But tests involving ionizing radiation like X-rays and especially CT scans, or those using radioactive tracers like PET scans, must be used very judiciously or avoided entirely, particularly in the first trimester, due to potential risks to the developing fetus.
And what about treatment during pregnancy? Can it be done safely?
Treatment is generally similar to non-pregnant patients, but requires very careful planning and crucial modifications. Radiation therapy and radioactive drugs are almost always avoided throughout pregnancy. Surgery can often be performed safely, especially after the first trimester.
What about chemotherapy?
Chemotherapy is more complex. Some chemo drugs can be used relatively safely, particularly in the second and third trimesters, but others carry significant risks of causing birth defects or pregnancy loss, especially if given during the first trimester when fetal organs are forming. So treatment might be postponed until after delivery, or the delivery might be induced early or performed via C-section to allow treatment to begin or resume sooner.
Does the mother's prognosis improve if the pregnancy is terminated?
The source notes that for most common types and stages of cancer diagnosed during pregnancy, elective abortion is generally not medically required and does not appear to improve the mother's overall survival outcome. Of course, the specific situation is always complex and requires detailed discussion. Treatment can also potentially interfere with plans for vaginal birth or breastfeeding.
It sounds like an incredibly challenging and emotionally fraught situation for everyone involved. And lastly, the source briefly mentions cancer in other animals. Is it common?
Yes, cancer occurs in many other animal species. There's a whole field of veterinary oncology dedicated to diagnosing and treating cancer in pets like cats and dogs, often using treatments very similar to human cancer therapies. Animals, particularly rodents, are also vital models in laboratory cancer research.
Are the types of cancer similar?
Often, yes, but the prevalence varies. A really interesting 2022 study mentioned in the source looked at cancer rates across hundreds of different mammal species in zoos. They found that cancer is virtually ubiquitous across mammals, Almost all species can get it, but the actual risk varies wildly.
Really? Like who gets it, more or less?
They found that species in the order Carnivora, think big cats, dogs, bears, seem particularly prone to cancer, whereas ungulates hoofed animals like deer, cattle, antelope consistently had very low cancer rates. The reasons for these differences aren't fully understood yet.
That's fascinating. And the source also mentions the incredibly rare phenomenon of transmissible cancers, cancers that can spread between individuals.
Yes, this is a very rare but real biological curiosity. There are a few known examples where the cancer cells themselves can physically spread from one animal to another, acting almost like an infectious pathogen. The two main examples given are canine transmissible venereal tumor, CTVT, also known as Sticker's sarcoma in dogs,
Okay.
and the devastating devil facial tumor disease, DFTD, which has decimated wild Tasmanian devil populations. In these cases, it's the living cancer cells being transferred, not just a virus causing cancer.
Transmissible cancer cells.
Yeah.
That's a concept I really hadn't considered before. It's
Yeah.
definitely surprising and a bit unsettling.
A very rare biological edge case, but yes, quite remarkable.
Wow. We have really covered an enormous amount of ground in this deep dive, all guided by our source material. We've gone from the ancient Greek word karkinos, the crab, all the way to nanotechnology, nanodrones directing immune cells. From the molecular chaos inside a single rogue cancer cell to the widespread societal fear and stigma that still surround the disease.
It really paints a picture of cancer not as a single enemy, but as this incredibly complex class of diseases. Diseases deeply rooted in our own biology, our environment, our lifestyles, and even, how we interact as societies.
Absolutely. And it leaves you with a lot to think about, doesn't it? Our source describes cancer progression almost like this internal evolutionary battle, this undesirable survival of the fittest, a rebellion of our own selves.
Right.
Yet at the same time, it details these incredible scientific advances,
Yeah.
real hope in prevention and treatment, and then it confronts us with the persistent societal stigma and deep-seated fear that still cling to the diagnosis.
It's a picture of amazing scientific progress marching alongside our deep biological vulnerabilities and these really complex, sometimes contradictory human reactions to illness.
It really makes you consider, what is this ongoing struggle to truly understand and confront cancer with its roots deep in our biology and its long shadows cast across society? What does it really reveal about us as individuals and as a species?
That's a profound question. How we grapple with something so fundamental, so challenging.
Exactly. What does this complex picture tell us about our relationship with devastating diseases in general and our constant push and pull between striving for scientific understanding and dealing with deeply ingrained human fear? That feels like a really significant thought to maybe just mull over.
Indeed it does.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We sincerely hope this conversation has helped structure your understanding and highlighted some truly key, memorable details from this incredibly complex subject.
Keep exploring, keep asking questions.